All right, so in this section, we're going to take a look at modeling for animation. So that is going to be our focus. Now, what does that mean? Well, when we create a model for animation, that generally means it's going to move. So not everything needs to move. For example, if we take a look at our ball project, the entire forest was pretty much able to be still, right? None of that needed to move, but the ball did. Now, we didn't exactly model the ball. We just kind of grabbed a ball and we went with it. And that's pretty much it. So we didn't really need to worry about modeling it per se. But in this section, we're actually going to create a very basic character. So we do need to concern ourselves with how to model for animation. We'll explore some more concept of this later on when we develop our actual character, but there are some very basic things we need to be aware of starting out. So let's go ahead and start with the first one, which is the pose that we are going to model in. Generally speaking, when you model a character, you're going to create a default pose, which is either a T pose or an A pose for any sort of character that has limbs. So what does that look like? Well, if we're talking about a human, the T-pose is the classical pose that any of you who play video games have probably seen before, where the character's arms are straight out to the sides, creating a T shape. So if this was our little character, that would be the setup there that the character would have. Notice that the legs come straight down. So that's the T-pose. The reason it's called a T-pose is because you can see the body looks a bit like a T. Now, the T-pose is one of the older methods. It's kind of tried and true. And in particular, it's designed to work really well with motion capture software. So you'll see the T-pose used pretty heavily in any sort of production that's going to take advantage of the motion capture, because that's the preferred pose for most motion capture software to start in. The advantages to the T-pose is that it is easy to rig. It's easy to make move, easy to make animate, because the arms are just straight out like that. The downside is sometimes you get some weird detail in the shoulders when the shoulders come to rest, and that's generally the position that people tend to be in. The plus side is the armpits and the shoulders kind of have the equal amount of distortion, equal amount of detail type thing. So if the character lifts their arms above their head, you're going to get a bit more detail there. Now, the A pose is where the character's arms are at a slight angle, at a slight rest. So the body is pretty much the same as the T-pose, but what's different here is the arms come out and form this sort of A here. And that's the reason it's called an A pose, is because you can see the arms coming out to the side there. The advantage to the A pose is, generally speaking, the shoulders of the character will look better. So this is going to give you a better result overall, just in terms of visuals in a default position. The downside is if you need a character to lift their arms over their head, it's going to pose some challenges. And a lot of the times the details under the arms get a little bit convoluted and lost. So those are some things to be aware of when it comes to the T pose and the A pose. Our character is going to be real simple today, so we're just going to start ourselves out in a T-pose here and just have the arms going out to the side. Now, what is another thing that is important to understand? Well, when we build our character, we want to make sure that it's facing forward in Z, so it should be facing the Z-axis, and we should make sure that it's mirrored across X. So when I'm building the character, essentially what you want to have is the character facing forward. So let's just draw a little human here. So the face would be facing forward. And side to side should be the x-axis, this direction. So in short, Z is forward, X is going to be sideways, and Y is going to be up. So that is going to be how we want to make sure we model it. So you want to make sure that you have that character facing forward in Z. Now, this is important for an animation perspective. We expect our character to kind of move around the world according to how the axes are already set up in terms of world space. So that's the reason it's important to kind of make sure Z is forward. Now, the reason why X is important is software always mirrors across X. So we can mirror across different axes inside of software manually. So we could say mirror across Z, mirror across Y. But generally speaking, X is the axes we want to be consistently mirroring across. Because Maya is not the only software we're going to work in, we may end up working in other software packages that need to take advantage of mirroring, and we may be doing something other than modeling that takes advantage of mirroring, such as rigging. So we want to make sure we're constructing our character with that in mind. Why are both of these important as a modeler? Why can't we just dive in there and make it? Well, it comes back to this idea of for animation. This thing has a purpose. It needs to be able to move. And that means what we're doing is we're thinking of the pipeline. So remember, coming back to the pipeline, the start is going to be where we're at here, where we're doing our modeling. But once the modeling is completed, it's going to be passed on to a rigger. And once the rigger is completed with building the rig, they can go ahead and pass that down to animation. So ultimately, our goal when we're building something like an animated character is animation, and we need to build that with animation in mind. In short, if your character can't be animated, it's useless. That's the reason why there is extreme value in learning the entire pipeline when you first start your journey as a 3D artist. You need to understand how each of the disciplines is going to operate. So let's say you're a modeler, you can create a model that the rigger is going to be able to rig, and maybe it makes the rigger's life a little bit easier. Likewise, it's a model that will be animating well, so it'll make the animator's life a bit easier. So if you don't understand the role of both of those, you might be producing something that looks great, but it may not be usable in a production sense. So the reason why both of these are extremely important, choosing your pose and making sure it's facing forward in Z and across X, is to make sure everyone else's life is a bit easier down the line once you pass this to them. All right. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started constructing our robot. But these are going to be some things we want to keep in mind to begin with. So I'm going to hop into Maya here. And we already have a new scene. Should be fine. And we can just start building this with some very basic primitives. Let's get started here. We're going to make a nice little floating robot. So we're just going to start with a sphere here. I'll just go ahead and create this sphere. And we'll just plop that right in the middle. And that's going to be our body. From here, we can go ahead and create some arms. So I'm going to hit W to activate my move, and I'm going to hit Control D to duplicate. And let's just give it a shoulder joint. I'm going to take my sphere here, scale this down, move this over. If you're wondering, mine is a little bit darker here. You can see my gamma is not set to the default. If you ever run into this, you can change that. Let me change that real quick so it's what yours looks like. I'll just switch this back to use non-tone map. Okay, so now that we have that sphere in place, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to create a cylinder to create an arm joint. So I can either grab this from the modeling shelf here, grab cylinder, or remember we can come up to our create menu. So let's get some variation in here, come up to create polygon primitives, just grab that cylinder there. And with the cylinder, I'm just going to move this over. I'm going to hit E to rotate. And what we can do with the rotate is we can hold down J. And you'll see if I'm holding down J, it's going to rotate in increments. We can rotate that till it's 90 degrees. Scale this down to be a nice thickness. And then scale it out to be our arm's length. And that looks pretty good. I think that should give us a decent looking arm there. After that, I'm just going to duplicate this sphere again to come in and give myself an elbow joint. I might make my elbow joint a little bit smaller so that way it's not looking too much like my shoulder. And I may even make this arm segment a little bit skinnier there, just scaling it down. So something like that. We can then hit W again to get back to move, and I can Control D to get this arm segment here. And we could do about a 50-50 there. I think that should be fine. After that, just to keep consistent with the design, I'll Control D to duplicate out the sphere here to create a hand. And I might make this a bit bigger than the elbow, just to kind of stick with how cartoony characters are constructed. And that will go ahead and give me my arms. Up here we have the shoulder, elbow, and this is going to be the wrist. What we can do now is we can go ahead and get some fingers in here. To stick with the theme we already have, we might as well just utilize the arm here to create our fingers and maybe shrink it down. So we can do this quickly by highlighting all the pieces of the arm hitting Control D on them to duplicate, and hitting Control G to group, and getting a group here. So now we have this group. What we can do is we can scale it down to make something that looks like a finger, and then move this into place over here. So that way we get a bit of a finger here. And then from here, we can kind of decide how we want the fingers to go. If we want them to have 2 little pincers, we want him to have like 3 fingers, but we can decide how we want that to go. We can also decide the placement. Do we want them here? That might look kind of nice. If so, are they going to be able to reach with a pincer-like fashion or not? I kind of like that design. Honestly, I think it's actually kind of neat, but you can design your hands differently if you would like. If we do go this route, I might make them a bit bigger. So maybe something like that. And then we could just duplicate this and move it down to the other side here. So we could just Control D on the group and move this down here to give us a little bottom pincer. And there we go. So that will go ahead and bend inward here. If you shift click things here and rotate them together, they're not going to work. But if you Control G and then move their pivot, remember you can hit D to move the pivot. You can kind of see how those will function. So we can see those will clamp together. Okay. I think that'll give us a decent little hand there. I'm still not completely sold on it. I might want to design it differently, but we'll just go with that to keep things moving here. So now that we have this set up, let's just check some of the things that I mentioned previously. You can see we currently have this facing forward in Z, and that just happened for us by default because we happen to create it there. But we want to be mindful of that when we get into things like texturing. So if we're going to add any detail to this robot, if we're going to give it a little face, we want to make sure it's this side it's being applied to and not that side. So this robot's pretty symmetrical. So we don't need to worry about it in the modeling so much as the texturing. Now, when it comes to the arm, notice we modeled the arm down X, and notice I only did one arm. And this is one of the reasons why we like to model down X, because what I can do now is I can predictively mirror this across X here. So we get the same arm on the other side with the same proportions. So how are we going to do that? Well, if we go ahead and highlight all of these arm parts, we can go ahead and Control D to duplicate them. So you're going to hit Control D. And then immediately what you're going to do after that, don't deselect, make sure you have them all selected still, hit Control G to group them. And that's going to put these all in a group. So what you'll see now is we have this group 4 here with our entire duplicate arm selected. So what's the point of the group here? Well, notice what happened with the group is it put the pivot here to the world. So our pivot is now at the world point. It's not anywhere attached to our object, and that's what we're looking for. If you don't see it at the world point, you can hit D to move the pivot and X to snap to grid and snap that back there, but it should be there by default. Now, the reason we like this is if we have the group selected here and make sure it's the group and not anything else, and we come over here to the outliner, you can actually hit a negative in whatever scale you want to mirror across. So let's say I want to go across the X-axis. I can switch the scale X to -1, and it's going to flip that in the other direction. So if we go ahead and enter -1 into X, -1, and hit enter, you'll see that it mirrors across to the other side. So now we have our arm perfectly placed on the other side, and we have our little character built. So that is going to be some of the reasons why we want to model down X, because from a modeling perspective, it makes it very easy for us to mirror. But also from any sort of perspective, if a rigger needs to place things like controls and they set up all the controls for this arm, well, they can just group these, then use that trick with a -1 at X to flip them to the other side. So it makes their life a lot easier when it comes to basic setup of things like controls. That's going to be our character. We're going to keep it real simple for this one, nothing super exciting. With that said, as a challenge, what I want you to do is go ahead and set up your own robot. Make it similar to this one. Unless you're a more advanced user, then feel free to kind of explore, go a little bit more advanced. But let's keep it real simple for this one, since we have a lot of things that we're going to be doing to this. And once you're satisfied with the design, we can save. I'll just come up here to File, Save Scene As. And in my directories, remember we added some subdirectories here. I'm going to come into characters and robot modeling. And we're just going to go ahead and switch this over to a my ASCII. And I'll just make this my robot model 01 and hit save as. All right, so that's going to get us all set up and ready to clean this up to pass it into the next stages, which would be things like rigging and texturing. All right, so we took a look at modeling for animation, and we did a very basic character model using polygon primitives. What I want to talk about now is going to be modeling for rigging. When it comes to modeling for rigging, there are a few things we need to keep in mind. Now, obviously, the modeling for animation, when I talk about that, it's the larger picture of animation. So that means the rig has been applied, and it's obviously for rigging as well, but it's for the process of animation. So that's where the T pose, A pose, and facing forward in that Z axis come in. But there's some things as a modeler we can do for rigging that makes their life a lot easier. So what are those things? Well, the modeler and the rigger aren't always the same people. In this instance, you're probably going to be the one who rigs your character. But when you get into the workplace or you're working on a team of any sorts, a lot of the times those will be separate individuals. What that means is you're going to pass on this file to them. And right now, this file is nothing but a hot mess here. It's like, what is this, right? And this is a simple character. Imagine if we were actually bringing over a complex robot like a transformer with all these different parts, thousands of different pieces. That's going to kind of be a nightmare for the rigger to kind of sift through and try and figure out. So when it comes to modeling for rigging, really what it's about is organization. There's a couple things we can do to make their life a lot easier. One is going to be things like naming. Naming will make life much, much easier for them. Naming things. Other things could be grouping in some instances. This isn't always the case. A lot of the times the riggers are going to do their own sort of grouping, so it's not always necessary, but it can be if you have a fairly complex system, or you may have something in place that the company wants you to have constructed in terms of group hierarchies to pass onward. That's something I've dealt with before. Other basic things you can do is going to be delete the history, which will clear out any of the various edits you have made, and freezing transforms. So these are going to be some of the common ones. Now, in this case, it also might be ungrouping. I'll put that here, ungrouping. We may want to get rid of some of the groups. But this is going to be these sort of standard things we're going to do once we finish up an object to pass it on to rigging. So we're going to name it. We're going to consider whether or not we need groups. We're going to delete the history, and we're going to freeze the transforms. So let's take a look at that process with our character here. The first thing I'm going to do is ungroup everything, and I want to show you some nice little tricks to just make our life easier there. I'm going to start by highlighting everything here, so that way we can select everything in the scene, and we'll be doing this several times in the cleanup process. From here, I want to get rid of the parenting of the group. So I don't really know what those groups are. If I pass that on to a rigger, they're not going to be very happy. They're going to be like, group 1, 2, and 4. Where's group 3? Yeah, we're going to want to clean that up. So the way I like to do this is I like to come up here to select, and we're going to use an option here called select hierarchy. So under select, you'll see select hierarchy right here. Now, when I click this button, you're going to notice nothing really seems to happen. But what happened there is it actually selected all the subgroups. So when you just select objects by highlighting them, like so, you'll see that sometimes it selects everything, but not always. So a sure way to do this is to come up here to select, go into hierarchy, and just do select hierarchy to select everything. Now from here, we can do the unparent hotkey, which is going to be Shift P. So Shift plus P is going to be unparent. And that's going to allow us to unparent these from everything we have here. So I'm just going to hit that hotkey, Shift P, and what you'll see will happen is all of these objects that were in groups leave the groups. So now we just have these groups up here. We don't really need these. To get rid of these groups, you can just delete these, and that will work out just fine. So you can find any of the extra groups that you don't need. You can highlight those and hit delete. That way they go away. Just keep an eye on your model. Make sure that nothing disappeared, because sometimes there's history tied into those groups and you don't want to lose your model in the process. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to do something called delete history. Delete history here isn't really going to be a big deal because we haven't done a whole lot to this model. But anytime you adjust a model's information, if you adjust the UVs, there's history created. And when you use default objects like this, there's actually history created. So let's take a look at the history real quick on this object. If I go ahead and select the sphere here, underneath the channel box, you'll see here are channels. This is where we're going to edit things. But beneath that are our inputs. And this is the history. Now, the history of an object can be edited live, but inside of Maya, this is not that good. Other software does a bit better with history, but Maya, not so much. So we generally want to clear this out. Now, the way we do that is we select that object and then come up here to our edit menu, delete by type, and we can select history. And when I do this, you'll see that that input disappears. So we lose that polysphere input. Now, this is just a default input that is on all objects. It lets you initialize them and change various things about them, such as their shape and their details, and we'll explore that more in depth as we go. But we don't need that here. So let's highlight the rest of these, come up here to edit, delete all by type history, and you can see we can clear the history on all of these at the same time. Another aspect is freezing transforms. So we've taken the time to build out this model, and we don't really want this to accidentally jump back into place. More importantly, we don't want someone else to make it jump back into place. So remember, when you're in a team environment, you're going to want to consider that. So I'm going to highlight everything in the scene here and just do a quick modify freeze transforms, and that's going to set everything to be at its 0 point where it's at. So now if I click freeze transforms, you'll see this is the 0 point. So let's say I accidentally move the shoulder. I could just zero everything out and it's going to pop right back into place. Very important to do before passing this on to rigging. Now, the next thing is a little bit of a tedious process, which is just naming. When you get complex characters that have lots of pieces, you have to name a lot of things. And that's sort of the case we have here. This isn't even a complex character, but there's a lot of objects here that we're going to want to name. So let's just get started here. We can click on the body here, and in the outliner, I'll just double click and rename it. And we can just go ahead and name this body. And then we're going to name the arms. Now, when you name the arms, you want to name it according to the characters left and right, not your left and right. So what I like to do is actually position the character to be facing in the same direction as me. And then I can think, okay, which is my left side, which is my right side, and I can name these accordingly. You don't want to name it based on the screen position. You always want to name it on the character position. That's going to make the rigger's life a bit easier, and it's also going to make the animator's life a bit easier. So what I'm going to do is start with this shoulder here, and we can start with a prefix such as left. And then what we can do is an underscore, and we can type in shoulder. So that's going to be our left shoulder. We can then come to the next section, and we can make this our left underscore upper arm. We can come to the next one and make this our left underscore elbow. We'll come to this one here, and we'll go ahead and make this our left underscore lower arm. We'll make this our left wrist. And then we're going to come to this here. We'll make this our left top finger joint, and we'll make that 01. And then I'll just go ahead and hit Control-C to copy the name and just Control-V to paste here. And you'll see since we put the 01 at the end there, it's going to go ahead and number these in sequence here. I'm not going to be too specific with the name on that. I can then select the bottom one here. I can double click and paste. And with this here, I can edit this and just switch top to bottom. And now we have the bottom finger joint 1, Control-C, bottom finger joint 2, double click Control-V, 3, double click Control-V, 4, double click Control-V, 5. Okay, so that's going to name one side. Now, you're probably thinking, wow, that sucks. We're going to have to name that whole other side. And you are correct, but we can save ourselves some time by actually lobbing off this entire arm here, hitting delete, and just mirroring these over again. So we could Control-G first. This is kind of a trick, and Control-D. Now, why do I want to Control G first, you'll see it puts it in a group, and what that does is it protects the names. Now, let me undo and just duplicate this to show you why. If I hit Control D, you'll see they get this 1 at the end of each of these. And we don't really want this 1, right? We'd have to go in and delete all those 1s. So by grouping it first, what we can do is we can protect it from the naming conventions of Maya. So when you hit Control G, it's going to protect that. And then when you hit Control D, it's going to duplicate without having the 1s at the end there. All right, so kind of a neat little trick for naming. Now from there, we can hit the scale X to -1 to mirror across, and we can go ahead and use some naming tools to help us out here. So the first thing we're going to need to do is select hierarchy. If you come up here to the select menu with this group selected, we can do a quick select hierarchy to grab all of these, and you'll see it will grab all of these. We can then come in here to the modify menu, and in the modify menu, we can swap out words. So if you come in here to modify, you see there's an option here called search and replace names. If we go ahead and open up search and replace names, it will search through the names and replace them with the words we put. So you'll see in the first section, we're going to put search for. So for that, we're going to want to put in left. So let's go ahead and type in left there. And then we can put in what we want to replace that word with. So in this case, we're going to want to replace it with right. Underneath there, you can see that it has different options, hierarchy, selected, or all. We'll just leave it to hierarchy, but we could put it to selected or all. It doesn't really matter. Probably not all, because I think it does the whole scene. But once we have that set, we can click apply. And what you'll see now is it swapped out the left and the right there with that name. So we saved ourselves a bit of time. So coming back to this one, you'll see that's all set up to be left. That's all set up to be right. So it makes our life a little bit easier. And we also have these groups in place. If we wanted to keep these, we could. We could name the first one here left_arm. And we could make this one here right_arm. Though we may ultimately get rid of those once we get into the rigging process. There is one last thing to be aware of, though. Notice there is a negative scale on this group. You might want to do a quick select hierarchy here to select the whole thing and do a modify freeze transform just to clear that out from your mirrored arm, because all of these will actually inherit that. And sometimes when you unparent them, they'll have values. You'll see if I hit Control Z and go backwards here to when this had a negative value, -1. If I grab something like the shoulder here and hit Shift P, you'd see that it has a rotate Y 180 and a scale of -1Z. We don't want that, but if I Control Z and put that back in the group here, and we do a modify freeze transform to get rid of that scale X -1, and I hit Shift P, you'll see it doesn't have any transform information. So just be aware that when you do that mirror trick, it does carry over transform information, and you do need to make sure you delete its history before moving forward. Okay, so at this stage, we have this named, we have it organized, we have the history deleted off of it, and we have the transforms frozen. So this is ready to be passed on to whatever comes next, be it rigging, be it texturing, what have you. So as a challenge, what I want you to do is go ahead and prep your character for the next stage. Go ahead and delete the history off of the object, freeze the transforms so everything is located where it needs to be, and go ahead and name everything. All right. So once we have that set, save it, and we can move forward.